I'd like to welcome everyone to a 9-part series on understanding complex trauma, my story and my coming of age, along with a multifaceted approach to healing from CPTSD. Each episode is going to range from 30 to 45 minutes long, and my intention with all of this is to simply educate, to inform, and to spread awareness on what is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Such an invisible illness, even within the mental health field, that deserves much needed attention. My last small discretion would be that I am not a medical professional. I do not intend to treat or cure anything. I am not affiliated with anything. And I am not a professional on CPTSD either, but I hope to be. I am speaking based on my own opinions when it comes to explaining CPTSD. All that I say to inform you that what I say has been taken from research, books, and other mental health professionals around the world. But the purpose of this podcast is to share my story from my point of view, and how I have taken what I have learned and applied it to my own journey on healing. So let's get started. As always, listeners' discretion is advised. Some topics I talk about within this series may be disturbing or simply too much for some listeners, and that is okay. It is especially common for trauma survivors to become easily triggered when hearing about topics related to their own trauma. I have experienced this, and I do not want to trigger anyone. So if you find that some material may be too intense or too close to home, I ask you to step away. And feel free to come back to this particular episode at another time, or simply skip this one, as the series is not so much chronological. With this series, I want to build an inclusive environment of listeners who come from many backgrounds. Maybe you just wanted to learn about CPTSD. You work with individuals with CPTSD. Or you may be a trauma survivor with CPTSD, and I am so happy you are here to listen to my story. A very vital component in healing and recovery is hearing other people's stories and how they came to be where they are today. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to my new series. People often ask me, why CPTSD? Other than the fact that I have a diagnosis that is not in the DSM-5. I think people find it so surprising that I have a fascination for a concept too unknown in the field of mental health. I got my bachelor's degree in social work, but everyone is always asking why not psychology. You see, I made CPTSD my concentration of study, in a very unwilling way. I wanted to do counseling, and I wanted to work with immigrant refugees, helping them settle in America, to obtain resources needed to enhance their quality of life. So social work made sense, at the time. I also wanted to be an advocate for issues in the education system, and target those issues on a state level. These were my original hopes and dreams, and then literally from one day to the next, my life changed forever. And that is what this episode is going to portray. So let me get to the root of defining CPTSD for those unfamiliar, which is okay, because studying this topic has humbled me by informing me that a majority of professionals in the mental health field have absolutely no knowledge on complex trauma, trauma-informed care, and on one of the greatest health epidemics in the world. And so I see my purpose in studying this topic and being an advocate and educator on CPTSD for as long as I have life. So what is CPTSD? Known as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. A majority of people already know what post-traumatic stress disorder is, but what does the word complex have to do with it? To simply differentiate between both, PTSD, a common term we hear when we talk about veterans or victims of natural disasters or war, is defined as a psychiatric disorder in people who have experienced a traumatic event, various events, or circumstances that were emotionally or physically harmful or life-threatening. The criteria specified for PTSD consists of several things. These include an exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. It moves into the criteria of having intrusive symptoms associated with a traumatic event beginning after the trauma occurred. And people with PTSD, we often see persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the event. And then they have negative alterations in cognition. And then finally, they have an altered arousal and reactivity beginning or worsening after the event. And the disturbances for the event impairs various functioning and inhibits their quality of life. On the other hand, CPTSD is definitely defined as PTSD with symptoms of psychological and behavioral stress responses. But the two key areas that differentiate complex PTSD from PTSD are the length of the trauma and additional symptoms associated with CPTSD. Sufferers of CPTSD have generally experienced long-term repeated traumatic events, whereas sufferers of PTSD can, but not always, develop PTSD from a singular traumatic event, such as trauma from war, which we see in veterans, a really bad car accident, a natural disaster, all singular events which affect the individual significantly. On the other hand, with CPTSD, a few examples can be ongoing domestic violence or exposure to violence, living in poverty for a number of years, living with an abusive parent, Another thing people need to recognize is that many people call complex PTSD childhood PTSD. The two C's often get confused and intermixed, but they are not the same thing. But I see that people use them interchangeably. And why is that so? Children do not have much of a choice to be in control of their lives and experiences. It is much under that parent or the caregiver to dictate this child's situation, such as if they're going to be at risk for certain experiences or if they're going to grow up in a healthy environment. So children who grow up witnessing abuse, who grow up in violent and impoverished communities, who grow up in and out of foster care under the guardian of a parent who abuses substances, all things which children are not in control of, which can cause PTSD. And there are so many examples for each. The key thing to pay attention to is all long-term experiences that create ongoing stress for years and years. But complex simply means that the individual is forcibly being exposed to ongoing chronic stress and having to endure trauma with no method of escape. It is not limited to children, but it is most commonly seen in children. Thus, we have childhood trauma. Another key difference is the additional symptoms that I mentioned. Sufferers do have the flashbacks, hypervigilant qualities, and avoidance to triggers, but they may also have problems with emotional regulation, aggression, and very consistent feelings of hopelessness, distress, and those related. Something I heard a while back that still resonates with me is the one definition of both diagnoses. I once heard someone say that the difference between CPTSD and PTSD is that with PTSD, you know who you were before the trauma. Your healing journey will consist of getting to as close as who you were before the trauma happened. But with CPTSD, you don't know who you are. You don't know who you're going back to. So you're essentially starting from the ground up and creating a new person. You have nothing to fall back on and no visual of who you were once before your healing. You are in fact meeting yourself for the first time. You see, the difference is how the trauma occurred. I was reading Shaylee Jane's book titled The Unspeakable Mind. She is a well-known psychiatrist and PTSD specialist. There's a sentence that defined traumatic stress disorder in such an intricate way that haunts me. She states, PTSD renders a person's emotional life barren. It mutes happiness and yields irritability that keeps sufferers on the perpetual verge of withdrawal from the world and alienation from those who love them. This is such a horrific disorder that I quickly became aware of. When the individual has trauma, that trauma becomes very much part of who they are. A traumatic event has this ability to take over your whole body like poison and leave you feeling paralyzed. Over time, your body does not adjust as it keeps happening, but it may trick your mind into thinking it has. There is so much that goes on within the mind that one's perception of the self and of one's world is extremely altered. Our emotions take the run of it as we try to adapt to our new reality by suppressing all emotion, or we become extremely reactive and destructive with ourselves or with others. It's as if we are now on a spiral of decline. We separate ourselves from what makes us human, our social circles or the potential of meeting new people. We distance ourselves from help, but worst of all, we leave ourselves behind and abandon our souls. Desperate cry to be met. It is tragic because hopelessness has a long time to transform our whole persona as is, so no wonder we fail to recognize ourselves from our once known innocence, and we are so quick to turn away and feel as if we are not deserving of hope because we are so broken. And to begin this discussion on what CPTSD entails, I want to start by saying that trauma is simply loss. Trauma is a loss when we are deprived of or have to go without something that we either had, that we valued, wanted, needed, or expected. Trauma is loss, and with loss we grieve. And the grief is the healing. In fact, that was the most important part of healing for me. My story begins very much before anything happened to me. If I were to dial it down to when it began, it would be the summer of 2018. In the summer, I went to college for the first time. I like early beginnings of stories, and I like building up to the point, or maybe I just like the chronological aspect of something. As a first-generation college student, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, but I went to college. I decided to go because it is what my parents had always wanted. It is what I had worked my whole life for. I moved myself in by myself. I went to a college 3 hours away from my hometown. Somehow I managed. And 2 weeks into my stay at my dorm, I had this really weird feeling. It was a feeling of silence. No, I know most people don't describe silence as a feeling, but it is so powerful not to be felt. It wasn't, loud. But it was peaceful. It was powerfully peaceful. I felt the silence wrap around me like a blanket. I felt a sense of clarity for once, but I wasn't sure why. And I left it at that. I went home for winter break and recorded myself talking about this feeling, which I wasn't sure what it meant. But I later came to know this was the beginning of so much more. Another thing that happened when I went to college was that I learned to sleep. I've been a light sleeper my whole life. I was very hypervigilant. I would lucid dream like a pro. And these are merely survival tactics that I have developed from living in a dysfunctional home. But I was not aware of that yet. Let's fast forward to next year when I transferred to a different university. I was living my best life. It was the fall of 2019. I call it the best months of my life, the best 3 months, to say the least. It was the first time in my life when I had a large group of friends, where I had a large group of support. I was financially supported. I never went hungry. I worked for leisure. I didn't pay bills. I had everything I could possibly want. And I had all the time in the world. I felt that I was at my peak. I was living my best life, and it could only get better from here. I felt happiness every day, for hours on end, all day. I was reckless, carefree, and very much driven to do everything and anything at once. At this point, I was not aware when it happened to me. Still at this time, my trauma was very repressed inside of me. It was very deep inside. I was very much living in the present, and I was enjoying myself a little too much. I felt safe and loved, and everything I had always wanted I had in that moment. I had a best friend who would always take care of me and would make me smile. He would be with me at every living moment. I was codependent, as you may call it. But to me, it was a breakthrough. It was everything I ever wanted. It was happening. Finally, I would be happy. I knew I had suffered in the past, but it wasn't true suffering, It was just a hard time. But now, it wouldn't be hard anymore. Or so I thought. I feel like some of you know where this is going, because COVID-19 hit the very next year. A month, literally a month after the fall semester that I started at this new university. Everything started changing within the day, one day to the next. I did not have financial support. I did not have as many friends. Everyone started to worry and panic about the pandemic, isolating themselves and canceling plans, and suddenly I couldn't even go to school. I no longer had my own apartment. I had to move back in with my mother and my sister in our single-room apartment. I was very devastated. I was very scared because everything I felt that I had worked for and how good I had it would all be stopped. I would reassure myself that this was only temporary, as these things usually are. And within a month, I would be back in school, in my dorm, back with my group of friends, attending all the clubs I was involved in, partying again, going to work on my own time, and making an income again. But it didn't stop. It prolonged. At this time, I didn't even have my best friend around all the time anymore. I would sneak into his house because apparently we couldn't drive on the streets during the day. I would find ways to see him, and when I couldn't, I would break down. To me, that was normal because I had never had a friend like this, but I also have never been attached to someone like this, the beginning of my codependency. Slowly during this lockdown, I became progressively worse, mentally and physically. I started having intrusive thoughts of wanting to hurt others and myself, something I haven't quite felt in a long time. Living with my mom was a struggle because I didn't have a space for myself. I was confined to a little corner. It was a curtain next to the fridge, and that's all I had. No privacy, no peace. No silence. So I couldn't really do anything besides sit there and listen to music or color and be in my thoughts. I was utterly miserable, and I craved social interaction. I couldn't even make a phone call because it just felt too awkward. I lost my appetite and became very depressed. Within a matter of days, I would eat a bag of chips a day and sleep all day. I became very angry if I couldn't go out and do things like I used to do. What was the point of being alive? What was the point of getting out of bed? I was extremely upset because for the past 2 years, I had put an incredible amount of time and effort in how I looked. I was the heaviest I had ever been. I was muscular, I was big, and I had always been called small and scrawny. And day to day, I just saw my muscles shrink. So my body became what I never wanted it to be again. Everything I worked so hard for just started to deteriorate. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore because I started to hate myself again. And that's when the flashbacks came. I was surrounded with pictures of younger me. Albums and scrapbooks of my childhood, and things of that sort. Every time I would look at one picture or anything from the past, I would be triggered. Especially on nights when I looked at those pictures, I would have dreams and I would wake up and recall horrifying memories that happened to me growing up. But I questioned if they were real, if they were just dreams. These progressively became more intense as the days went on. I had nothing better to think about but to be reminded of instances of abuse, instances of neglect, harsh words said to me. Experience I had with my parents that would warrant CPS called. Very much randomly throughout my day it occurred, without any warning. I would wake up and feel a lump in my throat. I wouldn't know where I was. Oftentimes I felt like I had reverted back to my childhood, into horrible memories that occurred to me. But why was I just remembering this? Now I felt like I was going insane. Were these even real memories, or am I just making this up because I am isolated alone and there's nothing else to do? I questioned what was happening with me. I would have arguments with my mother very frequently and it would end with me leaving, but having no place to go. I felt very stuck. Very much like everything was taken away from me in a way that I could never get it back. I could never get along with her, I said. Living there we were incompatible. It felt like a living hell. I was miserable every day. I was triggered every day. Anything that she said to me about how I was acting, how I was doing, sent me spiraling. So I began to self-harm again. I would cut my arms and legs. This was an attempt to make my intrusive flashbacks stop and allow me to release emotion and built up anger that I couldn't express at home. There wasn't a week during the pandemic when my scars wouldn't heal, before I punctured them again with a blade. I was reckless, impulsive, irritated, and very dysregulated. After a few weeks, I had lost all my quality of life. I was miserable from the time I opened my eyes to the time I closed them. The only time I felt peace was when I slept, and even then I would have intrusive nightmares and flashbacks. There were nights where I just couldn't sleep. I would just lie awake in tears, hyperventilate, give myself a self-induced panic attack that would only end in a trickle of blood. It got to the point where I started researching places to check myself into, like psych wards and psychiatric hospitals, because I didn't know what else to do. And mind you, this was during COVID, so making an appointment with a therapist, scheduling any type of appointment really with any doctor to discuss what was happening was nearly impossible. Going to the hospital was impossible. You wouldn't get a single priority because you didn't have COVID. You weren't having physical ailing symptoms. There was no way. There was nowhere I could go. My mind and body were crying for help, but it was nowhere in sight. I was having emotional breakdowns at least 3 to 5 times a day. I was simply inconsolable. What was affecting me was the sudden realization of what had happened to me as a child. Basically, for the first 18 years of my life, I had been a victim of extreme emotional neglect. I had been deprived of many things, and I had lived miserably based on my parents' actions to isolate me from building healthy social support systems, from having access to resources, and from being healthy. One thing that really affected me was how my inner child was always wanting love, was always wanting literally anyone to hear her out and save her from her violent home, to hear her silent cries, to feel any source of love and attention, and no one ever came. She never received, she never grew up, and that inner child died thinking that she wasn't deserving of love, that she was ugly, unwanted, fundamentally flawed, and that nobody loved her because of something she apparently did, that she was a sinful, wretched little girl. I could not recall a single time in my childhood when I was given one-on-one attention, when I was reassured or comforted or helped with something. And that's what really fucked me up. And all those memories of witnessing so much at so young, having to be parentified so young, constantly hearing my parents belittle me for being happy or passionate about something, and having to grow up hearing very negative things about myself that I later accepted. Realizing this at 20 sent me on a journey of no return, because suddenly I knew something I never once was aware of. I thought I had a pretty okay childhood. I thought I was normal and that I grew up normal. And coming to that realization within a span of a few months to a few weeks, I was never the same again. I felt like there was absolutely no point in me continuing to live, continuing to pursue anything based on my life outcomes and experiences. It was a living nightmare. I was unpredictable, explosive, short-tempered. I was manic, incompatible, unreasonable, and delusional. I thought I was going crazy, but the thoughts lingered in my head. A few weeks prior, no single traumatic memory popped into my head, and now that my trauma had all of a sudden resurfaced, I was lucky if I could go 3 minutes without an intrusive thought. I no longer recognized myself. I remember visiting my primary doctor at the time and seeing how horribly I was declining. She took it into her own hands to find me some help. She scheduled my appointments with psychiatrists because finding counseling at that time was nearly impossible, and I had no way of paying for anything like that. To name a few, I was prescribed Wellbutrin, Prozac, Zoloft, Trintellix, Abilify, Paxil, Valium, Buspar, just to name a few. I was on several of these at a time. A major concern I discussed with a psychiatrist at the time were intense anger episodes that would cause me to be completely destructive. I had always struggled with anger, but for some reason, once my trauma resurfaced, it took that to an all-new extreme. She suggested I go on antipsychotics, medication for people who have schizophrenia. That medication, on top of all the other ones I was pushing into my body, made me actually go insane. I started having difficulty deciphering from what was real and what was not. I would skip a dose and instantly go into a fit of mania. Shortly after, I got an IED, intermittent explosive disorder diagnosis, which ended up being a misdiagnosis. I didn't know who I was. I started having intense hallucinations of people being there, of moving shadows and figurines when they weren't actually there. I would break down in tears when I realized it was just my mind. I can't recall being in a worse mental state than that when I was on all these medications. Literally hating myself, I decided to withdraw, quit, cold turkey. That was an experience of a lifetime. You guys ever been electrocuted? Not like severely, but experience a jerk in your body as if your body took a screenshot, but then you were fine? Okay, so me quitting everything at once made my body do some out-of-body shit that I haven't forgotten. The major one were these jerks in which I felt my body glitch, and it felt like I was getting electrocuted. Everything would go dizzy and my equilibrium would do some questionable things. Along with that came the extreme nausea, lightheadedness with standing up, vertigo, migraines, weird cravings, and an inability to tolerate food. My doctor asked if I was pregnant multiple times. It's a whole show. Withdrawal was horrible, but literally once I stopped the SSRIs, the antipsychotics, my hallucinations ceased, my mood got back to normal as it could be, and my mania simply ceased. I preferred to remain drug-free than to endure the horrible side effects that came with all the psychiatric medication. I was warned by doctors that I was doing something very dangerous. I needed to be medicated because my mental state was declining so rapidly, but I refused. I didn't like the way my body felt and what came with the consequences of taking medication long-term. Much like I wasn't dependent on anyone, I didn't want to be dependent on medications. I'm not entirely sure how I survived the pandemic. Came out a completely different person than I was, but I wasn't dead yet. However, the whole concept of me having resurfaced trauma and inability out of it and a lack of support, all I could do was research my symptoms, learn about what it could potentially be, and educate myself on the psychology of the mind. Shortly before my 21st birthday, I was able to do a psychiatric evaluation that would assess me for a number of mental illnesses, so I could get some answers. I also had to do this evaluation to be diagnosed with ADHD, a diagnosis I had been trying to get since I was 14, so I could receive accommodations in college and give myself some type of break. Also so I could graduate. I did a 4-hour evaluation, and on the morning of my 21st birthday, I got my diagnoses. I remember sitting in a hot-ass car at a random parking lot with my best friend by my side, and I was on Zoom with this white lady who reviewed my eval report with me. From the top to bottom, she read that I had severe depressive disorder. No surprise there. Generalized anxiety disorder. Also no surprise there, but I'm surprised this one was as severe. I never considered myself an anxious person. Then came my long-awaited ADHD diagnosis, which she read out loud. I felt an immense feeling of relief off my shoulder because my whole teenage years were spent being gaslit by doctors and saying I only wanted to get an ADHD diagnosis because I wanted the drug so bad that I never had it. They often told me I never had it, or else I'd be squirming in my chair. But this moment was short-lived as she read the fourth and final diagnosis on that report, and that was post-traumatic stress disorder. I was so confused when she read this because none of it made sense. I didn't go to war. I didn't experience a horrific car crash or natural disaster or family death that could have given me PTSD, so why is that there? I didn't accept it. She didn't provide any explanation on that one. That could have helped me understand more. She just said to look into it because most criteria was met. But there had to be some sort of mistake. There was no way I had this. No way at all. In the weeks that followed, I did way more research. I looked into the symptoms more specifically, the criteria it takes to diagnose someone, and to my oblivion state, I hated myself for not looking more into this. I think it was simply because I didn't want to accept that I had trauma, even though it was forcibly making itself known to me. I learned that trauma is more likely to resurface when the body feels safe, and in 2018 I was finally, for once, removed from my dysfunctional home. Remember when I felt this overwhelming feeling of silence and peace? I no longer had to keep one eye open at night and ruin my sleep while my parents argued. And in 2019 was the first time I had someone to support me. The first time someone loved me, comforted me, and held me, literally. I always had someone to fall back on. I had such a huge support system. I was finally okay. I was stable and I was safe. So when I was reminded about my past, having to move back in with my mom, by being exposed to pictures of my younger self every waking moment, my mind felt ready to release that trauma that I had repressed as a child because I could not process it back then. And so it resurfaced, all at once, without warning. From one day to the next, I was a changed person. My mind thought essentially that I was ready to face it. The trauma was ready to make itself well known, and it was ready to be processed at 20 years old. Shortly after my PTSD diagnosis, I looked into what PTSD really was. And one day I landed on an article on something called CPTSD. So why not look into that? It listed a description of CPTSD and its symptoms, and for the first time in my life, I felt that I was reading an article about myself. That moment in time was incredibly significant. That's when my panic, my worrying that I was losing my mind simply ceased. I felt an aroma of calm. A feeling of this is exactly what I have. I'm not making this stuff up. It's a real thing, and other people have this. CPTSD is so real. Because with PTSD, the main three things are avoidance of trauma, a feeling of a sense of threat, and re-experiencing the trauma, which I definitely did have, but I felt like there was a whole other side to what was going on. And with those with CPTSD, you definitely have all those, but there's three more categories of interpersonal disturbance, emotional dysregulation, a negative self-view, and hopelessness. The rest is history. I struggled from then on to basically live a regular life. I was unable to take care of myself fully as a result of what I experienced, and I started having a lot of physical health issues emerge from this. And that's when I made the connection between the body and the mind. I did keep researching and grew fond of learning more about CPTSD, why it was never mentioned in my psychology or social work classes in school, and why doctors didn't pick up on this. I quickly learned that CPTSD is not in the DSM-5, so therefore it is not considered a potential diagnosis in the medical world. It doesn't exist. PTSD is there, but there's a whole other side with CPTSD, with the difference being CPTSD is not from a couple or one big singular event. CPTSD is a series of years, a prolonged time in which the trauma occurred. It's a taboo subject. Professionals are not informed, and they have little to no knowledge on trauma-informed care. No wonder they couldn't figure out what was happening to me. So I took it upon myself to learn as much as I could because I also knew I could never afford therapy. And explaining to them my trauma at the intake appointment was triggering enough for me. I just couldn't keep doing that without spiraling. So I would learn more about CPTSD, and my findings were out of this world. I became interested in how the physical body changes as a result of trauma, especially while a child develops. And my research being my only reassurance to what was happening to me, I clung to that for dear life. And this is where we are now. We fast forward 3 years, and I'm creating this podcast to share my experience and to share this journey of becoming a completely different person. Since 2020, I was never the same person again. My whole personality changed, and I learned how to essentially develop a personality. Of course, I very so often wish I wouldn't have had to do this. I constantly grieve the girl I was before this, and I have a lot of gaps in my memory about my past. But as tragic as this has been for me, it was necessary for me to ever live life normally. For once I started to have wants, and I started to find out what I liked and enjoyed. I developed genuine hobbies, I learned about new talents I had, I became capable of expressing my feelings and what made me uncomfortable. I stopped people-pleasing. I became incredibly self-aware, and I developed a new outlook on my life and what my future could look like. I learned self-love, got rid of bad acquaintances, and reconnected with my inner child. As cliche as all that probably sounded, this journey has been the hardest thing I have ever endured. I am incredibly blessed that this happened at the very young age of 20, because for most people, this doesn't happen until they're 30, 40, 50, or 60, and it's heartbreaking, because by that point, they had already created a life for themselves. Maybe not what they wanted, or maybe it's just what they thought they wanted, and it turns out to be completely opposite when the trauma resurfaces, and their whole perception of themselves changes. It's extremely heartbreaking and painful the older you get, and the later your trauma resurfaces, and then you have to grieve the individual you thought you were. I know it really messes me up to think about my trauma resurfacing at 30 instead of 20, where I would be. What bad choices would I have made? Would I have a job that I hate? And would I still be people-pleasing? But that is not my reality. 20 did feel late for me, but putting things into perspective, it is possibly the youngest age I could have been where this happened. As y'all know, I'm not a professional yet. I do not know everything about trauma disorders and what comes with the resurfacing of trauma. I'm only basing this on my experience and my experience alone. My information does come from books written from professionals in the mental health field. My knowledge comes from scholarly articles and medical journals. My information also comes from speeches and lectures about various health topics revolving trauma. I want to be telling you guys the truth on the subject. I don't want to lie to you guys because I personally feel like I have been lied to by many professionals, and it is not my intention to do that ever. Because as much knowledge as we have on complex PTSD, there is still so much we don't know. I hope one day to be a specialist on CPTSD. I hope I am given opportunities to conduct research on this subject and contribute towards changing the way professionals see the individual. It is so important to be made aware of the impact of trauma and how it shapes us, and how we can shape ourselves to be authentically well. So why did I decide to name my podcast Authentic Wellness? Well, there's a couple reasons for this. So what does it mean to be authentic? Let's begin with that. To me, it's a raw form of being. It's giving I'm real, I'm here, I'm an original product and I have a place here. I have made myself known, and you can sense my authenticity solely based on who I am. Many survivors of childhood trauma have never been able to develop a sense of self, and I think that has been a very big theme in my life and the lives of so many people who have been forced to live a life in a way they don't feel comfortable. They didn't really have a choice to make their own choices and to become their own person, to develop their own personality. And so I think as we become of age, these memories do resurface and we are confronted with the reality that this was our life, and now it is up to us to create a version of ourselves that we are proud of, that we love, and that can be loved. And that's the core to healing from CPTSD. So to be authentically well, it means to find a version of yourself that you're proud of, that you should be proud of. To be proud of who you are after the trauma and to not let the abuse and the pain from neglect and abandonment be a reason for you not to be here anymore. To be authentically well means that you're empowered from now on to seek the truth, to seek healing, to seek your needs, and to meet them every day. This is what we strive to be. The journey will be incredibly hard, so I'm not trying to undermine the pain and suffering that comes with living with CPTSD, but I am defining authentic wellness as something every survivor is capable of being. No matter what stage of healing you are currently in, we make a very important decision about ourselves when we acknowledge our painful past. We fight carelessly, or we fight knowing the battle is already won because we sit here today and recognize that we have life, and there is something that can never be taken away, and that is our authenticity. It's in there, I promise. You'll meet yourself truly and you'll love the person you are. You'll love that inner child so much. At this point in the podcast, I feel like I'm just going to clarify some things that I mentioned when telling my story that may not make sense. I mentioned the term of a relapse when I have told the story to other people. And I use the word relapse and they often get confused. I think when people hear the word relapse, they think of drug addiction and falling back onto using of substance. But when I talk about a mental health relapse, it's when your mental health declines once again. A relapse simply means deterioration after a period of improvement. You fall back to where you were, but not really. I understand that this is not the right terminology of the word, but it is the word that felt right and that I felt more comfortable to use when describing my trauma resurfacing. When I describe those months of my life when I became extremely confused about my identity, when I experienced a sudden shift from reality and my whole perspective changed when I came to terms with my trauma and my pain. Well, I declined so quickly and so significantly, I questioned so many things on who I was. Things started to make sense, but in a way, all I felt was just like I was falling and falling and falling. There is a state I've always felt before I had my mental health relapse, and that is an empty hole, where I never felt really complete in a way. I always sensed that something was wrong and something was missing, but I couldn't quite pinpoint that. I couldn't put into words what was happening to me and what I felt. I thought it was a personal issue, that I was just being selfish and not understanding how people thought and navigated through life. I had a very major problem, but I would just have to live with that because I'm flawed. But relapses are ways of your body and mind telling you that something is wrong, that something is missing. There is a gap inside of you that needs to be filled. That is why you cope so negatively. That is why when you stop using drugs, our body reacts so badly. Because what was filling that hole before? It was drugs. That gap, that hole hurts like hell. It hurts to live when you were so empty, so broken, so isolated from yourself to others. So isolated from yourself and others. The coping mechanisms fill that void which eats you alive. So why not relapse? You've spent your whole life trying to fulfill that empty space. It's only natural for your unconscious to keep trying to fill that empty space. So be generous to yourself. I want to talk now about symptoms. Symptoms of a mental health relapse and symptoms of CPTSD generally. Jonathan Shea states that PTSD can unfortunately mimic virtually any condition in psychiatry. That is extremely accurate. More often than not are people with complex trauma being misdiagnosed for literally anything but PTSD. CPTSD can be mixed up with so many diagnoses such as ADHD, bipolar and autism being the most common misdiagnoses in individuals who actually have PTSD. Before getting a psychological evaluation, I had been diagnosed with OCD and IED, two illnesses I did not have, but the symptoms were getting overlapped with symptoms of PTSD and having a history of trauma. It saddens me how this is true for so many people. A major curveball definitely comes with delayed expression or delayed emotional reactivity. Delayed expression is defined as meeting criteria for a PTSD diagnosis way after the traumatic event or events occurred. If you were to evaluate me for PTSD when I was 15 years old, even a month before my trauma resurfaced, I would probably not have met one symptom of PTSD. I would not have received that diagnosis because maybe you would diagnose me with depression. That's it. I did not have intrusive thoughts back then. I wasn't too emotionally dysregulated. I didn't have issues with triggers. I wasn't self-destructive. I was typically very normal and I felt normal. Did I act normal? That's a different story. But I didn't feel anything particularly wrong other than the fact that I was flawed, but couldn't pinpoint where. So delayed expression. Me expressing all these symptoms of PTSD years after some of the abuse occurred is a major reason why some people get misdiagnosed. Delayed emotional reactivity results in a delayed onset of PTSD. It's a result of their freeze response. When in the moment, people do not display the appropriate seeming emotions for what is happening to them. But because of what happened, it can manifest into greater emotional expression way after the event occurred or after a trigger of the event occurred. The body can also manifest this through pain, headaches, fatigue, compromised immunity years after the trauma. Did you also know that PTSD alters the way genes express themselves in a trauma survivor? The subject of epigenetics, which I can talk more about that later, but let's say your parent was also a trauma survivor, which they very likely were. 100% of their genes were altered as a result of what they went through. And with you, you inherited altered genes, neurons, brain molecules that were altered by PTSD, by the trauma. So the way you respond to stress when you are faced with something traumatic will depend on how your genes were formed. Your emotions may be more intense. You may not respond well to stress because your parents' genes were affected by negative factors that come with repeated stress. So you were already born having tolerance levels to stress. You can't blame yourself for this. It wasn't in your control, but this doesn't mean nothing can be done. Much like your parents' genes were changed as a result of the trauma, much like the brain, you can reverse those effects to some extent with proper healing and care for yourself. As we start to wrap things up with this first episode, I want to review some important takeaways about CPTSD. With my story and finding out that I had CPTSD, the first clue that something was wrong were the sudden onset of symptoms that affected my daily functioning and quality of life. I suddenly wasn't able to do what I had normally been doing. I became extremely depressed, but very irritable, easily triggered, and began having unusual flashbacks literally from day one to the next. The decline was very fast. And I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, but CPTSD sets in when you're least expecting it. I thought the pandemic would end, and I would pick up where I left off with everything. But oh, how I was mistaken, because that began a lifelong journey of healing. An onset of these symptoms can usually occur when the person feels safe and when the body is ready to let all that stored trauma come to light. We can also be triggered into this. With my example of suddenly being forced to move back into an environment where I was initially traumatized years ago, it triggered a part of me. Along with regular exposure of pictures of my younger self, my mind and my body began to remember some things. So triggers, like I mentioned, reminders of something of your past, being put in a somewhat similar situation after years of non-exposure to trauma, things like simply maturing, getting older, meeting someone that gives you something you've never had before, like love or something physical, being in a bad relationship too, being at the peak of your performance. It is so common for trauma to resurface when you think you have achieved everything and the brain is like, okay, we can address your trauma now, and the onset of other mental health issues. In some cases, people also get diagnosed with things like bipolar disorder. It may be something you actually had and have struggled with, so that whole process can be traumatic within itself and trigger something more. Maybe you sought help for depression and discovered the true cause of all of this was because of trauma. This onset of PTSD can occur from so much. It is important to be aware of these things. So how do you know your trauma is resurfacing? that you're experiencing what I want to term a relapse. You begin to question everything. What is real and what is not? And this is hard because you begin to doubt yourself. I know for sure I doubted myself that the abuse was even real because I had gone without symptoms for the majority of my whole life. But as you begin questioning yourself about the accuracy, for this, I want to suggest that you do not resist anything. You do not disregard anything. Write it down. Notice which events or ideas that have become more frequent in your flashbacks. What triggers you more? Where does your mind go when you get triggered? The mind is so powerful, it is trying to tell you something along with the body. It is trying to make you aware of something, and more often than not, it's not lying. This is your repressed timeline resurfacing and presenting itself to you. Don't gaslight yourself, thinking it is made up or over exaggerated. Maybe it might be, but you don't know that yet. So, as painful as it is, sit with it. Let's mourn. Let's begin this grief journey because by the end, you will become a better version of yourself that you never thought possible. This is going to feel like a hopeless spiral, but you need to keep going. You need to survive this because your aunt gave everything to allow you to be where you are right now. They pulled you out. They got you out as safely as they could. And so now you need to live for them because no one else will. If you're someone listening to this today and struggling with resurfaced trauma, I want to offer 8 suggestions. Of course, I'll provide way more insight on what you're going through in the upcoming episodes, but just to start you off, my first piece of advice is to seek help. As blunt as it sounds, we all need someone to listen. It may not be the best form of therapy, but having someone or seeking a professional who can be there and be aware of mental health and who can sit there and listen to you can help you process initial thoughts so you don't overwhelm yourself. Number 2, find someone who can be of support. This is incredibly hard if you are alone, if you have always grown up having no one, so I encourage you to find a free support group in your community and build off from there. Thirdly, I would suggest to research, but have a caution in this area. I know I personally dived headfirst into looking up my symptoms for researching CPTSD, and it did scare me. It made me very uncomfortable. So I caution you with this. Look up your symptoms, but don't get too deep into the subject because it may be extremely triggering. But it is good to be aware. It is good to learn the science of what you are going through. Learn about the brain. Learn how the brain works and how malleable it is and how it is able to change. Number 4. Write down your reoccurring thoughts, your childhood memories, the ones you remember. Write down which symptoms are more extreme than others and what happens when you spiral. Be very observant of what you feel, because you're going to look back at this and see how far of a way you came. Number 5, write down your triggers and come to the conclusion of what triggers you didn't have before. What is new? What is alarming? Number 6, very similar to the support one. You need an emergency contact, someone who you can call when you are having those suicidal thoughts, those thoughts of hopelessness, and when you're out of control, when you need someone to call for help. Number 7, be patient with yourself. Take a step back during this time. It is okay to fall back. It is okay if you need to take a break from work or school because you're in the process of grieving. You'll feel like you are slowing down, losing interest. Please have grace on yourself. This is only temporary. And number 8, let's meet the inner child. Who are they? Who is she? Who is he? What did she want most growing up? Go seek it out for her. Sit with her. Tell her you are here to save her, but that we must go through this one last heartbreak together. And that is to grieve each other, that we will rise above this with time. During COVID, I started to process the grief of grieving over the mistreatment of my inner child, but I have come such a long way. Because survival does happen. I'll finally end with a quote from one of the most powerful speakers on childhood trauma, Gabriel Maté. If you guys don't know who this is, please or listen to one of his speeches on YouTube. A physician and author who has dedicated his life studying trauma and development, he states, as adults, we realize that the separation from our authentic self is hurting us. We're meant to be here as ourselves, and we had to abandon ourselves and lose connection with our essence due to trauma. But we're going to find ourselves. I promise you, we're going to find ourselves again. Thank you so much for listening to this first episode of Authentic Wellness. I hope you guys enjoyed. Next episode, we're going to be talking about the ACE scores. I have so many more exciting topics for you guys. There's so much more coming.